everybody, and welcome to episode 16 of Gamers Without Borders. This is TestZero, and with me, the achievement whore, Gianni Chase.
What's going on?
And the master of disaster, Ozzie Arcane.
Who and what now?
Gentlemen, how are you enjoying the Steam Summer Sale?
Great, I haven't bought anything yet. Probably not going to buy anything, because I'm flat broke.
I bought the last DLC for Dungeons of Dreadmore for 74 cents.
I finally picked up Skyrim at 40% off, even though it's probably going to be cheaper later. By the time you're listening to this, you'll know whether or not we were right, because the Steam sale will still be going on, but this will be up a week later. But, in this episode, we're going to be talking about the evolution of game controllers and peripherals. So I figured the best way to go about this is to just start at the beginning. Not even the Atari 2600, though. I'm talking about the arcade systems of the 1970s. Back when they only gave you the exact number of buttons you needed.
Hey, did Pong even have buttons?
No, they just had the knobs, really. It was just kind of I don't even remember what an old arcade Pong console looked like, but it was just two knobs. I think they're called potentiometers.
And all you heard was doot, 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 doot.
But yeah, the Pong wasn't actually the first arcade system. It was the first successful arcade system. The first arcade system they tried to do was one called Space War. And you might have seen this game where you're kind of rotating around a planet and you have to try to shoot each other. That failed because it was just too complicated. Yeah, you think about it now, why that was too complicated, but no, Pong, it had a one-line instruction. Avoid missing ball for high score. And that was all you needed. You just needed the knobs, and that was it. And so that whole mentality of just give them as little control as they need, that was what defined that era of gaming. It was just really simple games that just did what they did perfectly, I guess you would say. They just focused on doing that one thing well, instead of trying to cram so much features into one game, and you just get burnt out on them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's easy to laugh at the idea that the other game was too complex, but, I mean, most people, when they're playing their first game, I mean, we've been playing games our entire lives, so it's easier for us to laugh at that, but for someone who's never played a video game before, I can only imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you hand somebody a controller, a modern Xbox 360 controller that has the 4 face buttons, the two joypads, the 2 analog sticks, the D-pad that sucks, the 2 triggers, and the 2 bumpers, then start, select, or start and back, and then the guide button. And usually there's other buttons on it if it's not a first-party controller, where it's like the rapid fire or something. And then they just look at it confused, and it's like, press the A button. And they have to look at their controller for like 5-10 seconds and look at all of them to see which one's what. And then by then they're dead. Yeah.
I can attest to that. My girlfriend is more of a PC gamer than she is a console gamer. That's just what she grew up on. IBM, 386, 486, Windows 3.1. She just grew up on the keyboard and mouse. So she never really had consoles. So whenever we're playing like a 360 game, and I'm like, okay, you gotta sign in, so hit the guide button. What? I said, the guide button. What? It's like the button in the middle. I was like, oh, give me that. Like, sometimes I'll just get fed up and I'll just grab it and be like, this button here.
Oh,
I'm slowly training her on consoles. She's getting a lot better, but for someone that never plays a console, I mean, just sticking that controller in front of them and saying, here, play, it could be a little overwhelming.
Yeah, so that's why you look at things, I mean, even back in the arcades, they had controllers that, they didn't even have a full D-pad. They had, 3 buttons. If you look at something like Defender, it had 3 buttons and it had an up and down. You moved left, you could accelerate left or right, and then you had a third button to shoot. Those are your 3 buttons. Then you had up and down to change your altitude. And that was Defender in the arcade. So they often had sticks that didn't even go in all 4 directions. which always seemed really weird. Or what about the ones that actually played with the trackball? Remember those? Stuff like Centipede.
Missile Command.
Missile Command, yeah.
Those horrible golf games, I can't understand why anyone would ever play at a bar.
Yeah, although that is really the one thing that arcades are still doing these days. A bit less so than they were doing 20, 30 years ago, but that's the one difference. You can walk into arcade and you can see controls and control concepts that you really don't see in modern systems. Because all these games have to be kind of optimized for the controller.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the real benefits of someone who makes an arcade cabinet. The arcade cabinet just needs to be designed for that specific game.
Yes.
It doesn't need to be designed for anything else.
Exactly.
Whereas with a console, that controller has to work for everything.
Yeah, so, and then you go into... But even though there were a lot of commonalities between these games, so then when they were ported to the Atari 2600 and other home consoles, then they could get away with just using the controller, which was just a standard analog joystick and one button. That so many people just playing games today can't comprehend how you could get away with only one button on a controller. Even I couldn't really figure it out, and because I started playing with the Atari 2600 about a couple years after I was introduced to the Nintendo, because my dad still had one out in the backyard, but he had... Well, it was in the garage, but he brought it in, obviously. But he had these third-party controllers that had more than one button on them. There was like one on the top of the joystick and then one on the base system. But it still only had one button. Both of those buttons did the exact same thing.
Yeah, I was going to say...
I never really understood that. It's just every time I tried to play a game, I thought maybe one button would do something different in this game. Or if I try a new game, maybe the button would have two different functions in this one. No. Every damn time, it was just the one button on those controllers.
Yeah, I remember I had a controller like that for the Commodore 64, and it always baffled me why there was two buttons and they only did the same thing. But I think it was really so they had them in two different spots based off of where you prefer to have it to push it.
Yeah, exactly. They had ones that looked like flight stick controllers, so they had one as a trigger, then one up on the top where your thumb would go, or sometimes they would have some on the sides. So they have like four buttons on the top of it, and they all did exactly the same thing. So if you look at something like that, that had the standard controller port that would plug into the Atari 2600, the Commodore 64, and later on the Sega Genesis. So you could use a controller like that on the Genesis, although they would still only do the one button.
Right. There's also the ColecoVision was another one that allowed you to swap out controllers like that.
I believe so, yeah. Maybe the Intellivision as well.
No, the Intellivision, their controllers were built in. You couldn't unplug them. This was pretty weird for me because the first console we ever owned was an Intellivision. We actually had the Mark II, the white one. So, and then we eventually went to the Atari 2600. So it was very weird going from that telephone-like controller with the number buttons.
The Intellivision was weird. I mean, I'm not going to say that it was bad. It was creative, but using it for actual gaming was strange because, especially the weird clicky disc that it had. But I mean, it had the numbers. They had like 1 through 9 or 1 through 10, and then like two alternate things. So it basically had a 12-button keypad like on a phone.
Yeah.
And you had these overlays, these plastic overlays that would actually slide into the controller, and it would tell you what the different things did. So you could like choose this to shoot this way, this to shoot that way. And some of these overlays actually had really neat artwork on them, just to make it all fit in. So that was just something else that was tangible. I always thought those overlays were really cool. I always thought something like that could be really cool for like PC games. That would be fucking impossible to do though. But they made a keyboard a while back that, unfortunately, I heard was actually not very great.
Board Z?
No. Yeah, I actually have a Z board right now, but...
Oh, Z board, yeah.
It was the Optimus keyboard, I think it was called, where you could... Every key was like a tiny flat screen was a tiny flat screen LCD display. It was like a little 20 by 20 display, so you could actually display icons on the keys themselves. So depending on what game you were playing, it would actually change what the icon showed. So like the WASD keys would actually turn into arrows. Like the different buttons would show each of your different weapons you had. Possibly it would actually show the the ammo you had for that weapon. Or even if beyond games, if you're doing something like Photoshop, like the X key would turn into the cut icon. Or the crop icon, or whatever the different buttons would do. So I thought that was a really neat idea. Unfortunately, the keyboard was poorly made and didn't sell very well. Yeah. But I would love to see somebody make that more mainstream, because the other mainstream thing that you see in PC gaming is the G board, where you actually have that little display on it, almost like a DS, where you have a secondary display on the keyboard itself that would display like your armor or your health or ammo or whatever, and it would display your current condition like that. I thought that was a really neat idea, but not very many games actually were compatible with that.
But going back for a second, we mentioned the ColecoVision. I know there were a couple...
we totally went off tangent. Let's try to. I totally derailed it. Let's try to go in chronological order.
There were a couple systems, I believe, though, that also had the controller hardwired to the system. Aside from that, because I think the Odyssey might have done that. I know the Japanese Nintendo, the Famicom
did that too.
And I cannot understand how anyone thought that was a good idea.
Well,
hey, let's hardwire these in, so if the controller breaks, you have to buy a completely new system.
Well, if the developers are trying to sell systems... Yeah, have you ever used a Famicom controller?
No, I haven't.
I have one it's like a third-party Famicom controller that works for the NES. It's weird. It's shaped like a Famicom controller, but it's colored differently, and it actually has the regular plug to plug into the NES.
I've seen those before, and I think there are some companies that actually do more reproductions of those.
And I thought those were really neat because they felt better than the actual Nintendo controller. So I guess we're going to step forward to the second generation of consoles, or would it be the third? Whatever the hell it would be. The one that came after the Atari and ColecoVision. We're stepping forward into the NES era, where they finally had more than one button.
Yeah, regardless of what generation it actually was, we're still more accurate than EA, who thinks we're just now going into Gen 4.
Yes, PS4. This is Gen 4. Fuck you, EA. Yes, EA, Japanese for no. But yeah, the Nintendo controller. A lot of people praise the Nintendo controller for being the best controller out there. No. The Nintendo controller feels horrible. It really... Any third-party Nintendo controller is probably more comfortable than the regular, D-pad block.
Well, I think that's probably what caused them to make the dog bone controller later.
I love the dog bone controller. I love how that feels. I always felt that was one of the best controllers they ever had for the system, because it was rounded, it was designed well for the hand, because the original NES controller was designed for function, not for form. It had just the two buttons, the A, B, start, select, and then your D-pad. And it did a really good job of differentiating each of them, because the A and B were slightly raised, they were brightly colored, then start and select were just kind of recessed down, and they were not as well needed. So you could hand the NES controller to somebody, and they would know the A and B are your main buttons to do things. They wouldn't try to jump by pressing the start button.
Though I wonder if the shape might have been somewhat inspired by TV remotes, but then again, the thing is, you aren't using a TV remote for minutes on end usually. Yeah.
That is one thing that I was coming up with something that you just derailed it. Well, the other innovative thing about the NES controller was the fact that it had the D-pad instead of the analog stick, which
I totally praise.
Which for decades was the norm for these systems. They just had a D-pad, and you moved using that instead of big, bulky stick that was coming out called the freaking joystick. Although, of course, they had their third-party NES controllers that some of them had a joystick, some of them had like a weird nub on there. I don't even know what that would be described as. It was like the NES Advantage or whatever.
Yeah, the NES Advantage.
No, the NES Advantage had like a joystick
Mac.
on it. The Max.
It was the NES Max that had that touchpad, that little nubby thing. But most people, it was mostly the black circle around that nub that was the actual D-pad. You were just kind of pushing the nub into it and then pushing that down.
That makes a bit more sense.
The NES Advantage was the controller that was like an arcade stick.
Yeah,
and it had
everybody always loved that. I could never really use it.
I didn't like it.
I would play at my friend's house, and he had 2 NES Advantages because he was rich or something, or he was just spoiled. So he had 2 NES Advantages, but whenever we tried to play something with it, I always get, can I use a regular controller? I was like, really? That's supposed to be better. I was like, it doesn't feel right.
There was one thing I liked about the NES Advantage, though, and I think it was the first controller that did this. It's the first controller, at least I remember, that had turbo for the buttons.
Well, the NES Max had that as well.
Yeah, it was just the NES Max had just the standard these gray buttons right above the B and A buttons that you just held them down and that was your turbo. The Advantage had actual like knobs that you could turn up or down how fast you wanted the turbo to go.
Yeah, you could set it to
and
like
in a game
10
like
hertz or 30 hertz.
In a game like Contra, or if you're playing like Gradius or Life Force, something that's like you're constantly pressing the button to fire, that can really help you out.
I remember there were some games that were actually coded in such a way that if it detected that you were pressing the button too fast, it wouldn't do anything. So turbo buttons wouldn't actually work on it.
The funny thing regarding the NES Advantage for me is I actually had to use it for playing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game when I was a kid, because when I was a kid I couldn't really grasp the concept of only tapping the button lightly so I don't jump too high in certain areas. So I'd turn turbo on and it would keep me from jumping too high so I wouldn't hit my head on the ceiling and fall into the water.
Oh, you're talking about the original...
That's actually a really good idea.
The original Ninja Turtles game on the NES.
Yeah, with the Advantage, the only time I ever used an Advantage was to play games that felt more like they were arcade ports. So I would use it on like TMNT 2, the arcade game, or Double Dragon, or Contra, or games that were ported from the arcade.
A second control, joystick to make it feel right.
Yeah,
did you use it for Karnov?
I used it for what?
Did you use it for Karnov?
Karnov.
I never actually played Karnov.
I don't think many people have. I was just being an ass.
Well, looking at other games that used alternative control schemes, remember Smash TV? The actual arcade version, it had no buttons. You just had 2 joysticks.
Yeah, but that was a SNES game, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was also an SNES game.
There's a...
They even had an NES port.
Yeah, there's an NES port.
It was actually pretty creative how they did the action. You had 2 different fire buttons. One, you press the button down and it would lock you in that position. The other one, you press the button down and it would still allow you to free fire.
Or if you had the NES Satellite or the Fourscore, you could actually use 2 controllers to do the dual analog shooting.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I saw it on...
I did not know that. That is actually pretty cool.
On a stream there, they actually had a satellite and they picked up a bunch of 4-player games to play.
Would you be able to... If you were playing single-player mode, would you be able to use both controllers for the one player? Or would pressing a button on the second one start the game for the second player?
I've actually only played it on the Super Nintendo and on Xbox Live Arcade, so I really don't know if that's possible or not. I'll have to boot up an emulator and try it out.
Because, using 2 controllers for one game, I thought that was actually a really creative idea. The only other game that I know did that, there might have been others, but the one that I know did that going a little bit back was Raiders of the Lost Ark for the Atari 2600.
Actually, there are 2 games on the NES that do that. The one. Gyromite.
Gyromite wasn't quite like that. You had 2 players playing as 2 different roles, more or less. But yeah, you could have just set the A and B buttons to the scientist, because he doesn't do anything with them. But that would defeat the purpose of it being a Rob the Robot game. So of course, since we were talking about controllers and peripherals, we have to talk about the Nintendo peripherals. We were on Rob the Robot, so let's talk about Rob the Robot. Rob was brilliant. Rob was absolutely brilliant. Because after the video games crash of 1984, companies didn't want to carry these systems in their stores. They didn't want to carry video game systems. So Nintendo was like, no, this isn't a video game system. This is a robotics kit. That was what they said. So they sold it with Rob the Robot and these games that it played with. I believe it shipped with Gyromite, and then you could buy Stack Up separately. And of course that came with the little blocks and everything. They look like kind of like tires. But that was what got Nintendo into stores. And of course, once they had the Nintendo Entertainment System, they could buy the game software to go with it, even though it didn't use Rob. So that was absolutely brilliant of them. It might have been a little dishonest because I actually thought the robotic system had potential. I honestly would not mind seeing the professor in Smash Brothers. I would not be surprised if they did that because they already have Rob in there.
Yeah, well, I think what we know is that Rob was probably the world's first troll. He trolls you when you're playing the game, and he trolls the retailers and tricks them into buying the system.
Well, it's not that they're being tricked into buying it. They got what they paid for. Gyromite was a good game as long as you didn't play it with Rob.
Yeah, it's pretty challenging to play that with a friend and just like, no, blue, red, blue, no, up, down, no, squish that thing. I actually had a play session with one of my buddies with that, and then actually when you get into the later levels, it gets pretty intense because you're just like, no, up, down, no,
and then you think about it, could you imagine playing that with Rob? Because
he just does stuff at random.
Long to do anything. You have to tell him to spin the tops. You have to tell him to open, close, get him over, and you have to command him to do each of these individual things. Which, I mean, that's still pretty damn cool. You use the TV to control the robot. I mean, back in like the early 80s, that would be pretty damn awesome. Do you have like a remote controlled robot? I always thought that was pretty cool. But it was, and of course it was controlled by the TV, and then used him to play video games. That was pretty cool, I think.
Of course, I never actually had Rob the Robot. I thought he just did the stuff at random.
No, it wasn't quite like that. I didn't have a Rob either. But one thing I still want to pick up is still a very infamous. Unlike Rob, this was pretty crappy. Although I do think it was rather misunderstood. The Power Glove.
You know, we're going straight to the Power Glove without mentioning the Zapper first.
I suppose we should mention the Zapper. The Zapper was impressive technology for its time, I will say. The fact that it was able to tell specifically what it was looking at with like pixel perfect accuracy, pretty much, that was impressive.
Of course, the downside was they didn't actually use it for that many things, though I believe there were more Nintendo games that used the Zapper than there were that used Rob.
Yes, there were 2 games that used Rob.
Yeah.
There were like 12 games that used the Zapper. There was a good amount. There was the Adventures of Bayou Billy, there was Hogan's Alley, there was Wild Gunman, of course Duck Hunt. There was a good amount of games that used it. Yeah.
There's one that I'm trying to find now, actually, for my collection. It was a black box game. It's called Gumshoe. It was a side scroller. You were like this little, kind of like it was a little guy in a trench coat. But in order to make him jump up the platforms, you'd have to shoot him.
There was another one where you don't control a baby, but you have a baby walking around across the screen. Baby Boomer, and then you have to shoot things
I think that was
a
a Color Dreams game. Yeah.
God, there was another one. There was like Chiller, which was sort of like a horror shooter game.
Yeah, that one you could actually use 2 guns.
And then there was another one called Gotcha, which was a paintball simulator.
It's actually kind of sad when you think about it that they had the light gun technology all the way back then, but a lot of modern systems haven't had that. And there've been like arcade games that have the the gun, but like modern systems you usually just kind of like move the targeter around
Well,
with the D-pad.
pretty much every system had a gun peripheral for it. I mean, the Super NES had one and they usually shipped with a particular game that needed it. Usually, I think for the Super NES, it was something like Lethal Enforcers.
Yeah, they had
on the Sega CD as well. Came with the gun.
They had the Justifier, the blue and I think pink one. It was in the arcade. It was blue and pink.
I think the problem with a lot of them though were I think a lot of those guns on some of the systems were like specifically designed for a certain game, and then like they wouldn't work with others. Because I remember there being like rail shooters on the PS1 that would not even allow you to use the guns that were for the system.
Yeah, that's just getting into douchebagginess. But, I mean, if you, again, think about it, if you have a game that is only compatible with a particular type of peripheral, that's still not terribly uncommon. But usually they do try to make these peripherals somewhat open source, so I think that's just sort of a matter of common courtesy, where if you have a game that can use another peripheral, like if you have DDR and the DDR pad, and then you have another game that isn't specifically DDR, but still plays with that pad, then you are able to piggyback on the popularity of that other game. So, because people bought these controllers that only play that one game, but then they see this other game that's compatible with it.
Yeah. Conversely, Activision didn't like that, and at first absolutely refused to let you use Rock Band controllers in Guitar Hero.
Of course.
Meanwhile, the Rock Band creators allowed you to do the opposite. You could use the Guitar Hero controllers in Rock Band, and
I don't think I ever had a Rock Band guitar. I just used the same wired Guitar Hero 2 guitar that I've had for the last 5-6 years now.
Yeah, that was
Which was it?
Fad that died fairly quickly, but that was a roaring fad at the time. I mean, Guitar Hero, we're skipping forward a bit, but I guess we can jump back a little later, but Guitar Hero was a phenomenon that really took off. The idea of peripherals for these games, the Guitar Hero controller was just, it worked for what it was. I mean, you could play this game with a controller, just like you could play DDR with just the controller.
They changed that in later versions.
It wouldn't be as fun. It wouldn't be nearly as fun to play it with a controller, because if you're playing with the controller, you're playing just a timing game. But if you're playing with the actual dance pad or the guitar controller, it becomes a rhythm game. It gets you into the mood. It gets you playing. It gets you into sort of the fantasy of like the guitar fantasy. That's what this thing played off of. And so many people loved it that they started picking up actual guitars and started learning to play. So I'm always reminded of those people as like, oh, you 5-starred Through the Fire and Flames on Expert. Try doing that with a real guitar, asshole. I was like, fuck you. I'm having fun. It's like, you don't see people do that in other games. It's like, oh, you got a 60-hit combo in God of War. Can you do that with real chain swords?
The funny thing is, I think there actually was, I can't remember what the game was called, but there was another game by another company that wasn't Guitar Hero or Rock Band, but they released a game that had a guitar that also worked as a real guitar.
Yes, I believe it was
Power
called
Gig.
Rocksmith Legends.
No, it was Power Gig. There was
Power Gig Rise of the Sixth String.
Yeah, that they gave an actual guitar with that. Like you could actually buy with a guitar bundled in.
And it had a little like this thing that connected it to the. It had like a reader that you plugged the guitar into like a USB converter, and that plugged into the system.
Yeah, and that was horrible.
The problem with that game was there was input latency, which is kind of unforgivable in a rhythm game. And B, it was a instrument training system that was crippled by the fact that it was a video game. So it made you play through earlier levels multiple times just to unlock more difficult stages, even if you were getting bored with it because you had to keep playing the same earlier levels.
Yeah, but I think Rocksmith actually got it right. Like I've heard nothing but good things, and these are from people at my work that play guitar for real, and they they swear by this. They said it's just like it. They'll actually teach you how to play the song. They'll actually teach you the chords. Actually teach you how to play guitar in real life because you are using a guitar. Like you use your own guitar. It's just this one cable that just plugs right into your Xbox, and apparently there's no latency like there was in Power Gig. People love it.
So, of course, going back a little bit, let's look at the...
Power Glove?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess we can look at the Power
I interrupted
Glove.
you when you tried to talk about that.
Yes. The Power Glove. I really kind of want to get my hands on this, no pun intended, and because a lot of people complain that it didn't work, but a lot of them didn't know how to use it properly. That was the thing. There was a lot of ritual associated with it, where you had to get the game adjusted to your particular movement type and get it set up for your hands. So I actually want to get a hold of one of these and play through a really hard game like Zelda 2 or Bionic Commando using the Power Glove. Just to show this is not as piece of shit as you think. But
I would love to get it just to reenact the Wizard because the Wizard made it look so cool. Him playing
did.
Rad Racer.
The Power Glove has like some of the best marketing ever. Because one thing you will say about Nintendo, they had a great marketing department. And then people started being aware that they were kind of hyping into the bullshit.
Well, you realize the Power Glove was basically just, the Wii remote way before its time.
Yes, it was before the technology was ready, I suppose. But the way the sensors actually worked on the Power Glove, they didn't work with light. They actually worked with sound. They made a high-pitched sound that the Power Glove would pick up. And based on... No, it was a Power Glove that made the sound. And then the sensors were actually speakers. So it was able to triangulate the position of the Power Glove based on how far apart it was hearing those sounds. That's how the Power Glove...
That's really weird.
That's how the
That
Power
just
Glove
blew my
actually
mind.
worked. That was how the Power Glove actually worked. It used sonar technology.
So there's a good chance that, the other problem with the Power Glove is due to the specific way that it works, I would imagine that means that the technology hasn't aged that well. So a lot of people might have trouble using it nowadays simply because it might not be in that good a condition anymore.
Right, which is why I would need to be careful if I ever found one. And another big problem with the Power Glove is a lot of people don't realize that it had those sensors. So they try to sell you the Power Glove without the sensors. It's like, no, it's the Power Glove. There it is. It works. But it doesn't work because they don't have any sensors. So you buy it and plug it in, and you literally can't get it to work because you don't have all the parts. But they don't realize this. Like, wow, this thing is a piece of shit, and I can't believe I spent $50 on this.
Yeah, and then you get people like some local bands in my area who wear it on their shows. It's like, yeah, welcome to our show. Look what I got, a Power Glove. All right, let's rock.
I can't believe they tried to sell it without the sensors. That just makes me think of all those times when I'm looking on like Amazon and I see stuff listed as replacement system. It's like it has no controllers or plugs or anything. I'm like, what did you do with the other stuff that went with it? How did you just get a system without any of the stuff you need for it?
Fell off a truck.
You stole it from someone's house and you didn't have enough time to grab everything? I mean, shit.
Look, do you want it or not? It's $50.
Of course I want it, but...
See, so jumping forward a little bit, we moved from the 2-button generation to the next generation of the Super NES and the Genesis. Which is actually really weird, because the Genesis came out like a year and a half before the Super Nintendo did. So it was almost like a half generation.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the reverse of the Wii versus the other current generation. Or like the Wii versus the PS3.
Yeah, and once Sega realized that the Super Nintendo controller was a little bit better and people liked actually having 6 buttons, then they had to come up with their own 6-button
controller.
Especially for games like Street Fighter where you actually need 6 buttons.
Yes.
Oh god, pressing start to switch between punches and kicks on a 3-button controller is horrible.
I've never even played it, but just hearing that sound, hearing you describe that, yes, that sounds like it would be horrible. And because, the Sega Genesis, the one thing I always felt was interesting about the Genesis was that it had the 3 buttons on it. It had A, B, and C. So, I mean, if you have something like Super Mario Brothers on the Nintendo, where A is jump and B is attack, if you had a separate button, that means you could do something else. So the Genesis had these abilities. You could have like one for jump, one for attack, and one for like bombs.
Yeah. Whereas on the NES controller, you had to use the same button to make Mario run that you did to make him throw fireballs.
Yeah, and from what I understand, that was actually a different design choice. Originally, it was supposed to be one button to run, one button to shoot, and then the up button to jump.
Oh.
Thank fucking Christ that did not go through the final version.
I can't imagine trying to do that by pushing up. That would be horrible.
Yes.
That would have made Mario harder than Ninja Gaiden.
So yeah, thank fucking Christ that they changed that idea. And also, I was thinking it was supposed to use a gun instead of like fireballs.
God, I can't imagine Super Mario running around with a 44.
Yeah.
Koopa's coming along, just like, yeah,
Bam!
gonna cut up you. Clack, clack, clack.
And get to the end of the game. Hey, Koopa, this is for taking my woman. Bam!
But yeah, I think the controllers were one of the big things that separated the Super NES from the Genesis back during the real console wars of the 90s. It really was the controller for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the Genesis, it had less options for what you could do. I mean, just thinking about something like the Street Fighter games, and then even Mortal Kombat, which still, you played on the Genesis with a 3-button controller. How the fuck does that even work? I believe it was just A, B, C, and start. I believe there was no way to pause the game.
Yeah, because they didn't
with
even
block.
have a select button on the.
Yes, they didn't have a select
Genesis.
button on the Genesis, so it had exactly as many buttons as the NES controller.
Though I will say one thing is that with the Genesis, most of the games that interested me were RPGs. So not having a whole lot of buttons wouldn't really matter
RPGs
that much.
You really need like 2 buttons, confirm and cancel, and movement, obviously.
Yeah. That's all you need.
So,
But I'll say this, so with the design of the Super Nintendo, man, that thing was perfect for fighting games like, just like
A,
Street
B, X,
Fighter,
Y,
Mortal
L,
Kombat.
R. But that was like a real leap forward. They went from 2 buttons to 6 buttons. So that's like a 300% increase.
Yeah. And I gotta tell you, so even to this day, like, most people will spend like $100 to $150 on a Mad Cat or a Horrid fighting stick for their games. I still, like, I have a fight stick, but I still will go back to regular controller with the D-pad and all those face buttons, because that's just how I learned how to play fighting games.
Well,
Yeah,
the big
same
problem
with
with the D-pad in fighting games is trying to do the semicircle combos, the semicircle moves.
I find it easier
You really
to do it
just have to. In a lot of cases, you do kind of have to have a joystick to do that.
No.
But I mean, I've been able to pull stuff off because you try to kind of roll your thumb so you go from down to right or whatever, and instead of like trying to make an actual semicircle with your thumb, which I still can't really do. But I mean, again, I never really liked fighting games on the Super NES. I'd imagine if we had a fighting stick, I might like them more, but my brother would just kick my ass every damn time.
Yeah, well, I'm with Johnny where I prefer the D-pad to the fighting stick. I think it really comes down to how you were introduced to fighting games.
Yeah.
Like if you actually spent a lot of time at the arcade, then you're going to be used to the fighting stick. But if you mostly played them on the console, you're going to be used to using the D-pad.
Yeah, and of course, a really funny story is when the Super NES came out, they had a couple of different bundles. One of them was just the system and the one controller. One of them was the system, one controller, and Street Fighter 2. Another one was the system, 2 controller, Super Mario World. Now imagine you're a parent and you have 2 brothers that are about the same age. Which bundle do you get them? That's right, Street Fighter with 1 controller.
No, all my life I've
That
never seen.
That was our gift that Christmas.
I've never seen a bundle like that. I've never seen a Street Fighter bundle before.
So what we ended up doing, because of course we couldn't obviously go out and get another controller because it was Christmas and all the stores were closed. What we did was we plugged one controller in, and then it was like, okay, you get to make an attack. Then we would make the attack. Then we'd unplug the controller, put it in the other port. Okay, you get to make an attack. But then you would do an attack that, for some reason, hit 2 times. It's like, oh, you attacked me twice. That means I get to attack you twice. So, yeah, it was the stupidest fucking thing, but we tried to do that until we finally got a second controller.
And that's why you don't like fighting games.
Possibly, yes. Because my brother always kicked my ass at him. I always liked Blanca in the original because it was just easy to use because I could never do the semicircle attacks, and Blanca just had the charge attacks.
I remember when me and my friends started playing Street Fighter, it did take us a long time to get used to trying to do the semicircle. Because it's like easy to just charge back and then hit forward, but then when you're not used to playing fighting games, you look at the semicircle and you're just like, what?
Or trying to do the 360 pile driver. Did you ever manage to pull that off?
I can do it fine now, but until recently I couldn't do it because it's one of those things where you just look at it and you tell yourself it's impossible, so you just don't even really try to do it.
I just stayed away from Zangief altogether. I looked at his moveset and I was just like, no fucking way am I learning him.
He has no projectiles. He's useless.
He's pretty cheap because he does have his fist spin thing that he does makes him immune to projectiles while he's doing it.
That was his method of projectiles. Instead of having a projectile, he would absorb them.
He can go through them and punch you in the face. But yeah, we're kind of getting off track now.
Well, no, we're about where we should be. So after the Genesis and Super NES era, we started to introduce stuff like the Nintendo 64, which was the triumphant return of the joystick.
And was also what I believe to be one of the ugliest controllers I've ever seen.
Yes, the 64 controller was pretty fucking ugly, I will admit.
But damn it, if it didn't feel good in your hands, like they made that really comfortable.
They did make it really comfortable, where you just kind of had one hand on the bottom part and one hand on the right. So I guess a lot of people just kind of were introduced to the kind of offset controller system. And of course, there were other games where you played it one hand on the left side and one hand on the right, although not too many games actually did that. Even when we got Mortal Kombat Trilogy on the 64, I still played it. You could use the analog stick, or you could use the D-pad, which I thought was a really nice feature. That you could choose which input you wanted to use, and a lot of modern games still use that, where you could use either the D-pad on it or the analog stick.
You'd be surprised how few don't.
Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I guess I'm thinking more about like indie games that are kind of side-scroller stuff. Because a lot of times the D-pad will be like options, like changing your different weapons or whatnot.
Yeah, but I mean, like nowadays, usually with like something like fighting games, they'll let you pick what you want to use. But if you're playing like an action game, like a third-person action game, like Devil May Cry or something,
obviously,
like that,
in a third-person game, you'll want to use the stick, the
yeah, but they don't even give you the option.
It's just that's your movement, and then the D-pad is other things. Like that'll change your weapons usually.
Yeah,
right, that's like your quick bar. I think in Fallout that was like your quick bar. And of course, between this, we also had the introduction of the PlayStation controller, which really kind of turned magazines on their heads because they started using button names that weren't letters.
Yeah, they're using symbols.
Like yes, and I remember the first couple years in like GamePro magazine where they didn't know if the PlayStation would succeed or not. So they wanted to be very careful about how they printed the codes. They always would spell it out, triangle button, X button, square button, circle button, instead of just like XO and then having like the actual icons in there. But then once the PlayStation 2 came out, I guess they realized, okay, this system is here to stay. We better find a way to put these symbols into our magazine.
One thing that really threw me off when the PlayStation first came out, I got so confused looking at that D-pad. I was like, how does that work? It's buttons instead of a D-pad. That's what it looks like.
That was actually a copyright issue. Because the Nintendo owns the copyright on the plus D-pad. which is why every D-pad kind of sucks compared to it. The PlayStation really kind of got it right, where you have the 4 buttons. It's still just a crossbar underneath. It's underneath the casing.
Yeah.
And but the way that, because it's a different shape than the Nintendo controllers and the Nintendo Super NES and 64, and I guess the Wii also has a fairly decent D-pad. Because Nintendo holds the rights on those things. So any other system, they have to do it a different way.
Yeah, most of the other systems kind of have a circle that has the cross in the middle of the circle,
which I've always hated, because I mean it's this weird like disc-shaped thing, and you just kind of move it around, and then all the stress is on the middle bar that goes down into the contacts. And if you put too much stress on it, that thing will break. And there goes your controller. And that happened when we were getting like third-party PlayStation controllers, and I've broken a third-party PC USB controller that way because they have that fucking disc on it. And I hate that damn thing. I just wish these companies would have a decent D-pad in their fucking controllers, but so few of them actually do.
Of course, there's also the fact that third parties are kind of notorious for having complete utter shit controllers.
Yes. I suppose that is also true.
Well, when you go back to the PlayStation, they actually did something pretty revolutionary. They when they first started off, they just had just a basic controller, and your face buttons, start, back, and all that.
But they also introduced the 2 shoulder buttons.
Oh yeah, the actual switch. Yeah, the 2 shoulder buttons there instead of they have 4 actually. The L2, R2,
2 on each side. Yeah.
Yeah, because Super Nintendo had the L and R. But then they introduced the DualShock, where they gave you the analog sticks in the middle.
And I think that is really
Rumble.
what became the standard for every system to come from then. That is pretty much the standard for every system since then, where you have the 2 joysticks, and like 90% of third-person action games use that same movement style. Left analog stick for movement, right analog stick for camera. Like 80 to 90% of the games you will use that, and if they don't, they better have a good fucking reason not to.
Well, yeah, and then it's really because of that we have modern controls for shooters on consoles that don't suck now.
Yeah.
Yeah, because every top 10 list I ever see now of top 10 first person shooters, GoldenEye 007 is always at the top, and I'm like, okay, yes, it is a good game, but it hasn't aged well.
I have tried to play it.
That I have it. I don't even remember the last time I attempted to try and play through it, and I'm so used to like Halo and Call of Duty and like all these games that like got the control scheme right.
Yeah. I
think it was Halo that got the control scheme right the first time on the console.
And of course, even Halo, you could change what option you wanted to do. Because I remember playing Doom on the Super NES, and that was really weird, especially going back to it after playing other first-person shooters on the console. Is like the D-pad was move forward and backward and turn left and right. If you wanted to strafe, you had to use the 2 shoulder buttons. Because back then, strafing was sort of an advanced technique. And a lot of first-person shooters didn't have that option. Well, they did, but a lot of games didn't have that. They didn't intend you on doing that. They intended you to stop, turn, and go in that direction.
Yeah. Like Doom is so much easier on Xbox Live Arcade than it was on PC or the older computer or the old consoles, just because you can strafe now easily.
Although I played Doom using a system called Z-Doom, which basically gives modern first-person shooter mechanics to older WAD-based games. So it's compatible with like Doom, Hexen, Heretic. I could not have gotten through those games if it weren't for Z-Doom, because it lets you use stuff like the WASD to movement and for move and strafe. Lets you use the mouse for aiming, because back then they didn't know what the fuck to do with mouse controls. Because a lot of PCs didn't necessarily have them. So you had to play it with the control button and alt and shit, and use the arrow keys to move around, which still feels weird.
Well, I think they also hadn't really thought of it, because in Doom you can't aim up and down. You just have straight forward.
But a lot of these, they use the mouse. You press forward with the mouse to move forward. How big do they think our desk is? How long do they think our arms are?
Oh God.
I like I don't mind right click to use to like open doors and stuff, but if you have a game that you have an inventory system, what are you gonna do? Thankfully with ZDoom I was able to use the middle click to activate items, or I'd use like Q and E and then I'd use Q and E to scroll through them. And then of course ZDoom also introduced the using the scroll wheel to switch between your weapons instead of using the 1 through 6 keys.
What were we talking about before we started rambling about Doom?
Oh, we were
the introduction
forward to the
of two
PlayStation
analog sticks,
and the introduction of the dual analogs.
That's also when we got vibration, which I think is
Vibration
probably
function was also from the N64. Modern gaming really does owe a lot to the N64 controller, as ugly as it is. It really did institute a lot of things because it had so many fucking buttons on it, and you could count them: L, R, Z, A, and B, and then the C buttons: C up, C down, C right, C left. Because it knew that the camera was going to be an issue, so it introduced those buttons to control the camera instead of using a second analog stick, which was creative, I guess, but they realized that they kind of fucked up when they introduced the GameCube controller, which gave the C stick. Although then going back and trying to play those older games on it, it really doesn't play well, especially stuff like Ocarina of Time. Trying to use the C stick on that.
I was gonna say though, I've never really seen the massive appeal of vibration. Like, I used to always switch it off back when they first introduced it, but I mean now the thing is I'll play games with it and I just won't even really acknowledge that the controller's vibrating.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, the Rumble Pack, that was such a strange idea. It's like, why would you want your controller to shake? What exactly does that accomplish? And it was a bulky thing, too. Yeah. It was a bulky fucking thing.
It was more about the immersion. The pack came bundled in with Star Fox 64,
yes.
And it would rumble in cutscenes or when you got hit or when you were close to dying. I mean, it got you immersed in the game. Nowadays, though, I think we're kind of past that now. Like, I don't even turn the rumble on any of my newer consoles.
I play with the rumble feature. But I usually don't notice it. I mean, sometimes I don't notice if it's on or off. One thing that the 360 will do is if you are low on battery, it will turn off the rumble feature, that was a nice trick. But then it'll spin those lights in the middle of the guy, and it's like, thanks for that. But I mean, it seems like such a strange thing. But then a lot of controllers that came after that would just have it integrated as part of a thing. But if you look at the N64 games, specifically stuff like Ocarina of Time, that had the Stone of Agony, or was that in Majora's Mask?
No, that was in Ocarina of Time. Like, you had to have that item, and you had to have your Rumble Pack plugged in to find like hidden shit.
But that was like purely a gimmick. But it's like, totally. If you had the Rumble Pack, you could do it. So again, they introduced these peripherals that were later integrated into in the main controls. So the idea of putting the rumble feature in these systems, it was a nice touch. But then as soon as they took it out with stuff like the 6-axis controller, people fucking rioted.
Well, the 6-axis issue was completely due to a patent problem because Sony had fucked over the inventor on money they were supposed to be paying him, and yeah, that's why that happened.
What was the excuse they used? They said that having the rumble feature would screw up the accelerometer controls.
I can't remember what their excuse was.
Even though the Nintendo Wii still had that just fine, and it played music too. It played sounds through the speaker.
Yeah, but that was one of those things where the real reason was something they didn't want to acknowledge at the time, and that's why they were going through the court over that. I know they eventually worked it out, but it was a mess.
DualShock 3.
Yeah, it's like, it's one of those things where that's probably one of many things that hurt Sony this past console generation, having lawsuits over their controllers and other various things.
Well, this is the same company that said that their cutscenes weren't pre-rendered. But of course, then of course you look at other things. Nintendo has really kind of been the innovators in this market, where they do something and then every other company is like, oh, that's so stupid, but then it becomes the norm. You look at the Rumble Pack, the D-pad, the fucking motion control with the Wii remote, and then of course 4 years later we have the Kinect and the Move, which of course suck. They don't have good third-party support for that.
But now we got the gamepad, which isn't doing so well.
We're now looking at the tablet integration. Like, look at the Wii U, and you've got the
tablet integration. I am really interested in. I mean, you go back, think about when they first announced the DS. This completely fucking alien system with 2 screens. What the hell are you gonna do with this? But no, you look at that, and if you're a developer, you just start thinking all the amazing things you can do with these 2 screens. You have you could have just a regular game that's double tall, or you could have the game on one screen and then action on another, or menus or something, or a map, or you could be able to switch to your items without having to go to a menu. And then, of course, they introduced the touchpad controls, where you could just touch it with a stylus or your finger, and then it automatically integrates it into the game. That is probably the way that a lot of gaming is going to go, because you look at stuff like the iPad or the Android market that has all this touchscreen-based gaming. There are kids today that can't comprehend playing a game that isn't on a touchscreen. It's like, I've seen this video of this kid who's like playing with an iPad. He's like a year and a half old or something. And he's like touching through the iPad to get stuff to work. And then somebody puts like a magazine in front of him, and they start touching the magazine, trying to get the pictures to move. And well,
my God.
He's a year and a half old. What do you expect? But he's learning about this technology that is very much going to be integrated into a lot of things. Not just gaming, but just dealing with like ATMs or whatever. It's just going to be a touchscreen instead of like keypads and stuff.
That's gonna be fun, considering how many people are gonna break the ATMs then.
I mean, maybe not immediately, but stuff is going to occur. I mean, a lot of ATMs have the touchscreen controls now. They've been having touchscreen controls for a long fucking time.
Because as someone who works in retail and has credit card machines there with a touchscreen, I cannot tell you how many times the customer just, failed to actually hit the specific button on the touchscreen, like they just got outside of it so it didn't react. So then they get mad and they start slamming on the thing.
Have you ever encountered ones, they are trying to use it, but it's not a touchscreen? There's a keyboard below it? Or a little keypad?
That I haven't had happen, but it's like, I'm just sitting there going, one of these days that screen's just going to shatter and the customer's going to owe the store $100.
No, this customer's going to try to sue you because your screen hurt their hand. America!
Damn it, you beat me to it.
I'm sorry, America!
But the problem with the Wii U gamepad though is as opposed to like say the DS is with the DS, as much as I hate handhelds, with the DS, the 2 screens are right next to each other.
Yes, that is also true.
When you're playing the Wii U, the TV's ahead of you and the Wii U tablet's in your lap.
Yeah, that can be annoying sometimes. To have to try to like see where you have to look up and down constantly. It's not that far. It takes like a half a second to switch between the two, but doing that over and over again, it can get annoying.
Yeah, my point is though, with the handheld, the DS and the 3DS, both screens are in your field of vision. Even if you're looking at one of them, the other one's still within your peripheral vision. So yeah. It's simpler.
So that brings us more or less to modern day. What kind of innovations do you guys hope to see or maybe want to see from game controls in the future? Well, I remember when the pause button was a new feature, back with the Atari 5200. That was a new thing.
I would actually like to see this Oculus Rift pick up a lot more steam and be more integrated into games, because in
the Virtual Boy 2.
Well, yeah, like we've got to the point now, like back in the day when virtual reality was a thing, it was like low pixelated, like you were like it was like low poly count, like you were basically like in Star Fox 60 or the first Star Fox.
If you look at Lawnmower Man.
Yeah.
Everything looked like that.
Yeah, everything looks like that. But like now we're at the point that like you're looking at the Unreal 4 engine, you're looking at all the stuff that we can do now on home consoles. Why doesn't anyone give virtual reality another shot?
I wouldn't be surprised if Nintendo tried to do it again. Although a lot of people will give them the stigma of they're not going to let them live down the Virtual Boy. I own a Virtual Boy. Admittedly, I think the nerd put it best. It wasn't called 3D Boy. It was called Virtual Boy. But the technology wasn't ready back then. They could have done it in RGB. They could have done it in all three colors, but the system would have cost like $800 a piece.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we're at the point now where we've got like these amazing graphics that we can put on home consoles. We've got the ability to make 3D,
yeah,
like,
3D
with the 3DS,
with glasses.
Without glasses. Just put it on the lens like that. We can combine that, and also, I've seen video of some guy with this Oculus Rift. He's like playing, I think, Battlefield 3, and he's also got like this little central treadmill.
Yes, I've
and
seen
instead of pushing forward
that.
on the analog stick,
you're walks forward.
Running on the treadmill. How cool is that? Like, basically, like for me, I hope I live long enough to see a holodeck from Star Trek.
If you think about it, that means that if you're going to play these kind of games, you have to pick up that treadmill You have to pick up that treadmill peripheral, which is going to be like $200, $300.
If it gets my ass off the couch
and that's like not at launch. That's like years after it begins its inception. Once they finally get the price down to something manageable, something that is in like the $200, $300 range, that's still a major investment for something that may or may not be adopted by a lot of these games. I think that's the big problem, is they have these peripherals that may be a great idea, but because other games aren't willing to take that risk and make sure that and support it, then it doesn't end up working. Which I think was the main problem with the Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy itself actually had a pretty unique controller. It had actually two D-pads, and then the A, B, and start select buttons,
and then the triggers on the back.
The triggers on the back, which was used for Galactic Pinball often. But the problem with the Virtual Boy is that it didn't have any third-party support. So, as innovative as it could have been, just because nobody supported it, it died out. On the other hand, the DS, people love that system. The DS was supposedly stood for dual screen, but I believe internally it was called the developer system, where developers just fucking loved the DS, and of course we got all the shovelware on it as well that just used the touchscreen stuff, but because they adopted it, it did so well, and now we're in like the third generation of the DS. We got the 3DS. So we're waiting on the next big thing. Whatever game company wants to do that, virtual reality or movement, like you want to do the Power Glove again? We got the Power Glove, we got the Virtual Boy, we got touchscreen. Let's integrate them all together. Let's make something awesome.
I'm just waiting for the ability to just plug my brain in like the Matrix.
Then you won't be able to get out because your body is dead in your chair and you're stuck in the game. You're stuck in the world.
Whoa.
Ozzie, where can everybody find you?
You can find me on planetarcane.blogspot.com or at Ozzie Arcane on YouTube.
And Johnny?
And they can find me at Achievement Horde John on YouTube.
And you can find me at TestZero.net, YouTube.com/DragonSlayerProd, and you can check us all out at ReviewersUnknown.com. Everybody, take care.
Love you. Only as a friend, though.